Welcome to the Dirt on the Past,
the Museum Edition,
a YouTube and podcast program of the Extreme History Project, which explores ancient and historical topics relating to artifact collections from the Museum of the Rockies right here in Bozeman, Montana.
At Extreme History, we explore the good, the bad, and the ugly about our human past because, let's face it, history isn't pretty. But it's so important to know because it's at the very thing that has led us to the most critical concerns in the present.
So join me, Nancy Mahoney,
and me, Crystal Alegria,
as we talk to archaeologists and historians who have been digging in the dirt
and in the archives
and in museum collections to uncover fascinating histories that are relevant to today's issues
and can help us move forward with a deeper understanding of the past.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we're the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. And we are again in the E.L. Wigand Digital Learning Studio at the Museum of the Rockies. So we've been doing this great collaboration so we can record in this wonderful studio. Now you can not only hear us on a podcast, but you can also see us and perhaps see any of the slides or artifacts that we have. So we're excited about this collaboration that we call the Dirt on the Past Museum Edition. So we're going to continue with this for a while. And today it's just me and Crystal again. And we're really excited about this topic.
We are
a crazy cool topic. We've been hearing about it. We know that there have been other people that have done other podcasts about it. We wanted to bring it into our history sphere here. We are talking today about pockets.
Pockets.
Yes, you heard us right. Pockets. And this is a really cool history. So it's like a cultural history. It's about gender. It's about class. It's about privacy, intimacy,
freedom,
anxiety, freedom, everything.
Agency,
fashion. I mean, so this is very cool.
Comfort.
So we are also going to really dive into sort of pocket inequality. So we're going to end with that and kind of where we are with women and men and pockets. Okay. So a lot of you women are going to find this really rings true for you, and men, it might open up a whole new world for you.
Right.
So today we are going to dive in, and we are drawing on information that's this incredible research that's been done by some women who have a background in fashion and a couple of books that's been published. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Crystal, to introduce that.
Well, this is a fascinating topic, and we've been talking about this for a long time, about doing this podcast on pockets for quite a while now.
Every time I stick my hand in a pocket,
I know, I think about it, or don't stick a hand in a
More
pocket.
Importantly,
That's when you think about it. So we're excited to talk about this today. And so we each read a book, and both of these books are going to inform our conversation that we have today. And the first one that you read, Nancy, was Hannah Carlson's 2023 book, so just out, Pockets, An Intimate History of Keeping Things Close, published by Algonquin Books. The second one was published in 2019, and it is called The Pocket, A Hidden History of Women's Lives, 1660 to 1900, by Barbara Burman and Ariane, published by Yale University Press. And so I have a picture. Did you bring your book, Nancy?
No, mine's an ebook.
Oh,
so
yeah, that's right. You got
that was the
fastest
way to get it, because we had made a decision quickly. We had to substitute topics.
Yep.
But these books are great, and you can find them anywhere.
Yeah.
I think some of them have an audio version, although I couldn't get. But there's also great lectures online and podcasts with the authors of these books. So definitely we'll have a link to some of that, their names again, so you can find them if you want to. But they're written in a way that it's so accessible. It's very accessible history. And it's fascinating.
This book especially has these amazing collections in it. So it's a full color book. I'll just kind of pull out some, so you can kind of see. It's just so beautiful. And so this one, they really highlight a lot of museum collections, and they have just these beautiful photographs of these artifacts. So I highly recommend getting this as a visual, as a This is a soft copy. It's not a hard copy. So, and it isn't very expensive. You know how sometimes these collection books can be really pricey, but this
with
one
all
is
the
very
color
affordable.
printing.
Yeah.
And the one I read has color images in it
Yeah.
too. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah, we
Yeah.
have some guests watching us while we're
Yay.
podcasting. And one of them is tiny, like this
Yeah.
big. She's so cute. Hi.
And she's waving, so we have to
And
wave back.
I don't think she has any pockets in her,
I don't think she
baby
does.
clothing. Okay. So just to keep us on topic. So we're going to start with Hannah Carlson's book, Pockets: An Intimate History of Keeping Things Close, because she starts by looking at how far back until we see things that we could call pockets. So the first thing she does is mentions, and I always like to start with the etymology of a word. So the word pocket comes from originally an old French word, poche, poke, it becomes in sort of Anglo-Norman. And then when you add on the E-T-T-E to sort of make it small, so poche meant a bag, and then poke became a bag in Old English. And then if you add pocket, that becomes your pocket. And so that becomes something that the bag is that you're carrying with you, kind of attached to your clothing, because that's sort of how it starts. But she wants to look at the origins of when we first see people referring to and carrying something. So I want to go to outside of Europe, even, or early on, where we don't have the kind of clothing where you would attach or sew in a pocket. So the sewn in pockets definitely come later, but let's look at what we call sort of this folded clothing where we're wrapping our bodies in cloth. So if we go to that first slide, and we have Chelsea today, Ashley's out of town. So yes, so she is helping us with all of the technical aspects of what we're doing today. So if we look over on the right side, you're seeing the sculpture, Greek sculpture or Roman, wearing a toga. And these togas, the way you were supposed to wrap them, you could often rather have these folds in them. One of them they would refer to in Latin as a sinus, and that meant sort of this folded secret space. And that space was a sort of a temporary pocket. It was a fold that would be there while you were wearing your toga that way. When we look at how other people were dressing with cloths around their body, we look at Japanese clothing, we look at clothing in India, and so many parts of the world, people were draping beautiful fabrics and garments over them. And sometimes there were folds within them, or there would be some kind of sash or some sort of belt or string around the waist where they could attach things to. But we don't really get something like this pouch or pocket until we get more fitted clothing. So maybe let's go to the next slide. And what Hannah Carlson starts talking about is that it's really in the 1500s, sort of around 1540, 1550, that we see men sort of proudly displaying very fancy pouches tied around their waist, sort of to a belt to the exterior. So these tied on pockets are something that both men and women were doing, but men especially had very fancy ones, and they were tied kind of up close to the waist. I mean, and here we have people in layers and layers of amazing fabric and dress, and definitely high status men, but you'd have all kinds of people having some sort of pouch. Now, of course, it might be made out of linen or silk, depending, or leather, depending on what you're doing, what your status is. But a lot of times these were decorated, and that would be something that would be sort of proudly worn on the exterior and displayed. So it was sort of this public way of showing that you had this pouch. It was something that was important to display. And then really, as we get to the end of the 1500s and into the 1600s, that's when men start to give up that spectacle of the exterior purse for a pocket that's integrated into their breeches. And their breeches are sort of like bloomers, I guess we'd call them, bloomers, breeches. You know, when men start wearing trunk hose, they're calling them all those things. And it's sort of at that time that men could put things then into these envelopes that started to be sewn in. Oh, that's your slide. So I'm just going to wait here and kind of leave it there. So this is what Hannah Carlson starts talking about, that in 1540 is sort of the earliest, and she doesn't have a specific name of any tailor, but you start to see this through the 1500s really catch on. And by the 1600s, she says that really they're kind of giving up the spectacle for secrecy, and there's less public facing of the pouch. It's more personal and private. And it did, though, create a lot of anxiety going forward, because now you don't have all of the things you might carry kind of displayed on the exterior. You have also at the same time, right around 1600, the invention of basically a hand pistol, a revolver. So
very small.
it's small,
Yeah.
not tiny, because like for
Yeah.
our, when we think of like a tiny little revolver that we could stick in our purse, but it is, I think I wrote it down. Let me see if I have it. But it is one of these wheeled revolvers where you can preload it, and it's
Okay.
actually that men are worried about being hidden. If you can hide it in your voluminous breeches, that sometimes we're like as big and
Yeah.
fluffy as sort of, you know, pumpkin kind of these pouches
those
things.
pantaloon
So you
kind
could
of,
exactly, you could
yeah.
hide things in there. And so there were a bunch of edicts and things that said, I mean, Queen Elizabeth, all of these folks were saying, you can't have these internal pockets.
Yeah.
This is dangerous. They feared for assassination. And indeed, Prince William of Orange. So I'm going to skip ahead to that image real quick,
Yeah.
and then
There it is.
So here we go. In 1584, what happened was there was a gentleman who comes to see Prince William. He's allowed to come in, and concealed within the pocket of his breeches is this revolver. And he gets close to the prince, and then he says something to him and moves like he's going to hand him a letter or something. And then what he pulls out of that pocket is the revolver, and he shoots him, and that's it. Prince William of Orange is dead. So the assassination. So there's a lot of anxiety around these pockets and what you could conceal in them. And I think for men in that case, because women were still making these exterior pouches. So let me turn then back to you a little bit, because we want to see what's going on with women in the 1600s and 1700s, and these hand sewn tie-on pockets. And the book that you read, I just found fascinating, because they went to some really interesting primary sources, like in London. So again, they're kind of focusing more on Europe, but that's where we get all these pouches and pockets really becoming a thing. And that I thought was fascinating. So kind of a different women's history now.
Right. So so this history that they looked at took place primarily in London and throughout England. And so that's where they got their data for this book. And they really did a study of pockets, these tie-on pockets. And maybe Chelsea, you could just go to that picture. Yeah, so these are kind of what those pockets look like, so you have a better understanding. But I want to just kind of dial back a little bit and talk about why we're excited to talk about these pockets today. And they started in this book talking about the importance of finding information through material culture, through these things that people have left behind. And so as we're looking at these pockets, we can glean so much information about just normal women's lives based on what these pockets look like, what how big they were, how small they were, what they were made of, what was inside of them, all of these things,
So
you know. Yeah, they have, there's so much information to be gleaned just by looking at these pockets that have been left. But they look at a lot of museum collection pockets that are in collections, but then they also looked at documents. And the main collection of documents they looked at was from London's Old Bailey Criminal Court. And they really looked at 572 cases that happened in this criminal court between 1676 and 1904 that featured pockets. So if the criminal case had any mention of pockets, they looked at it and brought that into this book in some form or fashion. And so, of course, a lot of these pockets that they're looking at were then stolen, and that's why they're in a criminal court. But they're not just looking at people, high class people's pockets, they're looking at people of all classes, which I think is really significant and important.
Right. So sometimes we're looking at the pockets of a victim who was
Yeah.
either maybe murdered, and then we have the contents of those pockets, or we're looking at a perpetrator of some crime and she may have come in and then had her pockets gone through. So exactly as Crystal said, it's sort of like that, giving the voice to people who maybe couldn't write, weren't literate, didn't
Yeah.
keep diaries. Those are the people who are lost to history. And yet they get to describe, and their contents are described, and they get asked questions about
Yeah.
what was in their pockets or what was stolen from their pockets. So we
Yeah.
get such a richer picture.
And what they were doing when their
Yeah.
pockets were stolen, or what the, you know, the high class women were doing whose pockets were stolen. So we learn all this information, and they have all this in the book, which is just fascinating. So I loved it. I loved that aspect of it. So, but these pockets, the first documentation of women's tie-on pockets, like you see here. So these are pockets. These are pretty big. I mean, our pockets today are not
Those
this
ones
large.
are quite large. And some of the ones depicted in images aren't as big. So I don't
Yeah,
know for
but they
reference if
and
these are always the size.
they were always often this big or bigger. Some would go all the way down to your knee. So these were not small pockets. These were pockets meant to hold quite a few items. Some were a little bit smaller, and some were more tiered shape dropped. And we'll look at some of those here in a minute, but you'll just see how they are tied on. And you can see that they were usually in pairs. One was on one hip, one was on the other hip. And of course, that was probably for balance. Sometimes they would have a third pocket that would be behind them. And so you could have as many of these pockets as you wanted, but they would wear them under their clothing. So this would be, you know, if you think about women in the mid 17th century and going forward, women had a lot of skirts. They had a lot of layers of skirts. And so this would be on closest to their body under a lot of those skirts. And so then all those skirts would have slits in them, so they could just reach their hand in and get to the slit that was in the pocket.
So in this picture, we're seeing just her most basic under layer. Because these are the things that the outer garments often wouldn't be washed nearly as much. They were fancy fabric, were elaborate, but then underneath, it's those underneath underwear layers that you would launder when you would try to get clean. I'm not sure how well people were cleaning themselves during this era. We've done another podcast on that.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's almost as if these pockets were kind of part of that underwear layer.
Yes.
They talked about doing laundry. The pockets were often included
Yeah.
with sort of the linens and the underwear.
Definitely
underneath.
Definitely part of that
Even
that
though they're
intimate
beautiful
apparel.
sometimes.
Yeah. And they were worn close to the body. So you think about the things that are closest to you, and the things that are in your pocket were important and were worn close to your body. So that's going to be part of this conversation going through. But they're beautiful. They're very beautiful, even though no one ever saw these pockets most of the time. You know, probably you saw your own pockets. Maybe your partner or husband saw your pockets. Maybe if you were from a higher class household, the washer people saw your pockets. But these weren't to be displayed openly. But even though they weren't, they still embroidered them beautifully. So Chelsea, if you or Nancy, you can do it, I guess, too. So look at these. Aren't these just beautiful?
So are these ones that are in museum collections?
Yes. And so this one on the left is kind of from that mid 1700s time period, and the one on the right is from 1784. And these, you know, these women would have probably embroidered their own pockets, or they could have purchased them from someone else who embroidered them. If you want to go to the next one. And so some of them, of course, the different materials that they used were silk. Sometimes these were made out of silk. This one, the one on the left, is a pair of quilted silk pockets from about 1740. And then one of a pair of linen pockets embroidered in silk is on the right, kind of 1700 to 1725, somewhere in there. But you can see how delicate they are. And sometimes they were made out of wool. Sometimes they were made out of cotton. If you go to the next slide, there might be the one right there on the left is made out of embroidered cotton. Cotton was a big deal in that early 1800s time period. And so sometimes they were made out of also out of leather. And so the ones that were made out of leather were more utilitarian and heavy duty. So that would be people working on farms in with animals, hard labor work. These women would use leather. And they did talk about one set of leather pockets, tie-on pockets that had been mended and mended and mended and were almost just worn right through in places. So leather was really is very sturdy, but these women were using these pockets pretty heavily. One on the right is velvet. I think that one's beautiful. Yeah.
You almost wonder if these were things ever given, in a bride who might
Yeah.
have been getting
And her
married.
trousseau.
Exactly,
Yeah.
part of her
Yeah.
trousseau. They also mentioned, which I thought was fascinating, that when you look at the shape of these, and then you
Yeah.
have that slit
Yes.
right there where the hand would go in, they're like,
Yeah.
you can't help but see this shape that resembles female genitalia. And so they
Right.
were saying, this intimacy, this close to the body, this shape, because they also were saying there were absolutely no records of patterns or how to make them. So for over a century, women must have learned from other women
Yeah.
how to make them, and they have this quite standardized shape and use, and then the embellishments and maybe the particular fabrics vary, but they aren't necessarily something you could buy until a little bit later, it
Yeah.
seems like. So they
Yeah.
started out
They're
really
very
as
personal.
very personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes me kind of want to talk a little bit about that idea that we talked about before with kind of that privacy. So these pockets, these tie-in pockets were what you would carry next to your body. They were where you could put things that were private to you
Right.
because no one was really getting into your pockets except yourself, usually.
Right. Right. We like to say, yes,
Yeah.
like today, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so a pocket is a very personal thing. And these women, one thing that they noticed when they were going through all this data and all this information is that women at this time in the 1700s, early 1800s, really didn't have personal space. A lot of women didn't have personal space.
Right.
Even if you were of upper class, you didn't have a lot of space that was just your own. It was always, in upper class, you shared your household with many people, your family, but your servants and just a lot of different people. And so you didn't have even a room to yourself. You didn't even maybe have a cupboard to yourself. And so these pockets really became a private space. And of course, if you were lower class, working class or even lower than that, you really didn't have any space. And you didn't have, oftentimes, if you where you lived, you shared space with many, many other people. And so these women use these pockets for their private things. And oftentimes, those private things were some of the only things that they owned. And so they would keep them in their pockets, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Nancy? I think was such an interesting part of this pocket discussion.
Yeah, I mean, they would talk about too, if you were traveling somewhere and arriving somewhere, so many important things you would have to have on your person, a trunk, a suitcase, that's harder to manage. Women back then, I mean, carrying that or having that carried for you, it's a little more suspect for theft, but these would be the things that you'd want to keep close to you. And in going through the lists of some of the things that they found in pockets, sometimes they were
Yeah.
just scraps of fabric, things that maybe they planned to use later, things they might need in their lives. So it definitely seems to me that women were at a disadvantage but felt the need, and having them under, as a layer under these huge dresses. I mean, women's costume during this period, especially in Europe, it's labor intensive to get dressed.
Yeah.
It's hard to keep everything clean, especially if you're doing other people's laundry for them. And as you said, you often didn't have any private space. And so just that bit of fabric, I can see why they're so large now,
Yeah.
because you think,
Yeah.
maybe you did need to put the whole revolver in there
Yeah.
or something, to keep yourself safe. Who knows?
Right.
But
Right.
how fascinating
Yeah.
too. And I feel like this is something when I've read historically or where I've even seen historical films, I don't think I've really been cognizant that these were what women had as pockets during certain
Yeah.
periods.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal. Think of all the layers you have to put on, and then you have to
I
tie on
know.
one more thing.
Well, these
And if a
pockets.
string breaks or it wears through, or if someone knew just how to quickly slice it. I mean, and
Mhm.
in different periods, some women wore pockets on the outside as well, like public facing ones when they would go out. But I
Yeah.
would think these were the ones where you'd really want to keep something incredibly safe,
Yeah.
and close to your person.
So when I was reading this book, they talk about what are in these pockets, and so I just took a few things that I thought were
Oh,
interesting.
please.
And so
Yeah.
there's some that, there's a lot of times people carry money in their pockets, and sometimes women carry large amounts of money in these pockets. And so it was devastating when their pockets were picked, and that's why they were in criminal court.
Ugh.
And the reason why, of course, they were carrying money to pay rent, and so it was their rent, or this one woman had just cashed out her stock and was going to pay off some bills, some bigger, larger bills that she had. And so she had cashed her stock she had cashed out her stock and was walking to pay the bill, and someone, grabbed her pocket, slit it with a knife, and ran.
So
And they caught him.
I want to
And
ask
so,
about that because,
yeah.
as you said, these are under their clothing. So I was trying to
Mm-hmm.
think about then what it meant to be a pickpocket. I feel like there's this
Mm-hmm.
incredible association I kept coming back to with crime and pockets through
Yeah.
this whole thing, which was interesting. And I mean, that was the thing we were always taught to fear anytime we went into New York City in the 80s when it was a little scary. And also if you traveled anywhere.
Yeah,
And I
you
did get
always.
pickpocketed once.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
it's a horrible feeling because it is so close. But
Yeah.
how does someone get under this? They must have known
They had
where they're likely
knives.
to be. So
Yeah.
they would slice
They
maybe
would
through the
slice through the
skirt.
whole thing. Yeah. And
Wow.
so and oftentimes the women talk about that they would get that they would get cut when they were slicing.
Getting
And so there would
slashed.
be
Oh.
blood on the person's hands. And so that's how they knew that, they'd say, chase that guy. And he's got, the blood on his hands. So
Right.
sometimes they catch him that way. But yeah, so it's, but it's a very personal, indignity, probably even more so than today, to get pickpocketed at that time, because they were very conservative and didn't show any skin. And so to have that kind of thing
That
happen to that
violation.
violation,
I
that's
was
the word I was
wondering
looking
too
for.
if
Yeah.
you had any of these men who would be just awful, who would maybe use affection and a woman's affection so that he could get close.
Yeah.
And if your hand
then
is
grab
around the
it.
waist, it's not that far to find the slit in the skirt and go
Yeah.
into the pocket.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
intimacy could be dangerous.
But
Yeah.
anyway, what else they'd have in their pockets is oftentimes they would have food in their pockets. So bread crusts were common. I thought that was fascinating, or little pieces
Got
of
a little
food.
snack.
Yeah,
I
gotta,
always like to have a snack in my pocket. I see Chelsea nodding
yep,
too.
I'm like, yeah, I
love
get it.
snacks. Yeah. Especially if you have kids, you always need a
Yeah,
snack in your pocket.
exactly. Pieces of clothing that they weren't wearing. So a lot of times, because of
Interesting.
like what you were saying, these dresses had pieces to them. So you could take off your cuffs and wash those, because that's what usually got the most dirty. And so you could easily take those off. Your collar, you could take that off and wash it. But you could also, if you were getting warm, you could take your collar off and put it in your pocket. So there was things like that were in the pockets. Also, they would have their caps, just like today, if you wear a
Sure.
cap, but then you get hot, you take the cap off, put it in. Money, of course, like I said, ribbons, threads, scissors, pins, all those things for stitching and darning were important. Jewelry also, and sometimes women carried their jewelry that was, that had a lot of wealth or had a lot of value
To
in
keep
their
it with them
pockets to
and
keep
didn't
it
want to
safe.
show it. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And
Getting
so,
back to the sewing too, they
yeah.
talked about that. Hannah Carlson talks about that too, that compared to what's in men's pockets, women always had sewing implements and thimbles, and they were sort
Yeah,
of
thimbles.
expected if they were going somewhere or had some that if they had to sit, that they could then be busy and doing
Yeah.
something feminine and it's sort of domestic and yet productive. And that's not the kinds of things men were carrying in their
Yeah.
pockets.
Women
Yeah.
were always expected to be busy.
Mm.
They could never leisurely sit and drink coffee or anything like that. They always had to be busy.
Did they
industrious.
ever have flasks in their pockets?
Not that I read about.
Okay,
but
interesting.
they talk a lot about how women would have money for for pints for beer. And these women were always stopping somewhere to get a pint. On the way, on the way to the pub house, they were pickpocketed or something like that. So
Sure.
I was like, wow, they drink a lot more beer than I thought they did in those days. They'd have keys. They would have
I always wondered about keys. I mean, and
yeah.
keys were sometimes really big back then, so you
Mhm.
needed a big pocket.
You
suppose.
did,
Yeah.
you did. And if you were upper class, you had keys to your house, to your garden, to your cupboards. You had keys to everything.
Today, the
Linen
keys are the
closets.
bane of my
Yeah.
existence. They're bulky, they're big, they don't fit in my pockets very
Yes.
well.
So one other thing I wanted to talk about that I thought was so fascinating in this book is that another thing that was found in these pockets of these women oftentimes was these things called duplicates. And the duplicates were basically these receipts from the pawn shop. So a lot of you remember probably hearing this in that pod because we listened to a podcast and they talked about these duplicates. So a lot of women, because they didn't have space, like we are talking about before, they didn't have a lot of personal space, and some women didn't have space at all. They would use pawn shops as storage units, basically. So they would take a piece of clothing or something of value to the pawn shop and they would pawn it, get the money for it, use that money if needed, but then they would make sure to go back and get that object before the pawn deadline, before you lost it to the pawn shop. And then they'd take it out and then they'd pawn it back to the pawn shop. And so it was kind of this way to store things
that maybe you couldn't or
that
didn't
you
want to carry all the time.
yeah, because you didn't have any space, they
So
just didn't have
interesting.
anywhere to put this stuff. And so they used it as kind of like a storage location. And these duplicates, these pieces of paper that they would then carry close to them because they were worth a lot of money, were basically equivalent to money in their pocket. And so if they lost that duplicate or that little receipt, they basically lost the item that was pawned at that time. So these duplicates were really cash as well. And
Right.
so
And if someone took that,
yeah,
then it could have been something you lost in gambling or something to pay a debt. And if you lost your duplicate,
yeah.
that was it.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, I'd like to have one more thing I want to
Okay.
talk about
Okay.
about this book, and then we'll get back to you and the other book. But this book was so interesting in that one of the other things that was always in these pockets was amulets. So they found a
fascinating.
lot of concealed amulets within these, and I just want to talk about a couple of them because I thought they were so fascinating. Because I think today a lot of people, of course, we don't have pockets that we carry these things in, but we have purses.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of people carry amulets or pieces
Like a
that
lucky charm
like a
or
lucky
something.
charm or something that
Remember having
you
a
think will be
rabbit's foot when I was
protective.
little? That was the big
Yeah.
thing to give you
Yeah.
good luck.
Yeah.
Which seems
Something
creepy
that
right now that I think about it, but it used to seem cool.
in our day, like in the 80s, the rabbit's foot was all the rage.
It was.
Yeah.
And
So
you were so
don't judge
excited
us.
to
So and here's I'm just going to read a couple quotes. So as observed in 1869, an old woman always carried in her pocket a dried toad as a preservative.
Rabbit's foot than a
Yeah,
dried
I know.
toad.
Than a
Right,
dried
Chelsea, I know. Yeah,
dried toad
Go ahead.
as a preservative from smallpox. So that was kind of a way to keep yourself safe from smallpox in those
Sure.
days.
I was thinking about medicines if that was things they could carry.
Yeah. And then another thing was this woman, her name was Bridget Bourne, explained in 1750 that a sciatica bone was among the few things of no value which she had in her pockets. Of course, it was no value to anyone else, but it was very valuable to her because she felt like that bone, like a little kind of bone, would help her with her sciatica. So these were things that would help with her aches and pains. And then another woman, Mary Marshall, who was found drowned in 1796, had in her right hand pocket a large key, a silver thimble, a farthing, which is money, and a cramp bone and a gold ring upon her finger. And so the cramp bone was something that would help alleviate cramps. So, yeah, so all these amulets, which I think are fascinating, and these things, of course, were kept close to the body, these amulets, because that was how they would have their most effective protection for these things they were trying to protect against. So, all sorts of cool things.
You mentioned cramps, so
Yes.
I'm thinking about women and their cycles.
Yep.
Do we have any sense that any bits of fabric or anything might have had to do with a
Could
woman
have. Yep.
if they had to go out and it happened to be that time of the month and they weren't pregnant? I
Yeah.
sort of wonder about. I mean, that's the other
Probably
thing
there
you find in a
were.
woman's purse or
Yeah.
pocket. Yeah,
Yeah,
would be
probably at that time it would just be scraps of linen
something like
or
that, right?
or some sort of fabric. Yeah, so probably they did.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay,
So,
so let's go a little bit more back to what's happening with pockets, and we'll look at what's going on. Oops, I'm going the wrong way with men, and here we're sort of seeing
mm,
that idea that pockets and the anxiety around the secrecy that pockets could afford people, that things could be hidden close to their person, and that a lot of people worried about what could be in them, what could then get close to somebody, and then all the more shocking, of course, if you were pickpocketed. And so, kind of these scenes, and we get to a period where women in the 1800s we're starting out, we have very voluminous skirts, and that's where you could see if they're going out, they could have a purse, a pocket on the outside that might be able to be tied around the waist. And that would be the
mhm.
one all the way over to the right. And then as women's fashions changed, so we had in some cases a straightening out of the skirt up front, and then all the extra fabric was pushed to the back in a bustle. And so the pockets that used to be easily accessed down the sides, where a woman's hands would go down. Now those slits were back in the bustle. And Hannah Carlson tells a funny story about trying to reach into there to get some money to go on a bus or something, and how awkward that is, and how horrible. And then otherwise you have to carry a purse, which also starts happening when you have these empire waists, where now the waistline was up so high that you couldn't even tie on a purse around your waist, and you have this garment that doesn't lend itself to a bulgy pocket. And so women were complaining about not having pockets and being forced to now have to carry something in their hands. Whereas men and the development of these three-piece suits meant that they could have their hands free. They could have their hands
Yeah.
out in public because everything could be in. And then it led to, this is what was fascinating to me, especially in the 1700s, the miniaturizing of like everything. So you would get a miniature, that's where you get these pocket watches. You get, so you can tell time, you don't have to look at a clock, you have your pocket watch that'll fit in, you have pocket knives, you have little grooming devices, small combs. So not only things that maybe were personal or that a woman might need, but a man, that's where you get a small flask, and that's appropriate. And maybe you had to be upper class to afford it, but also holding snuff. So you could hide it in your pocket. No one has to know what you're doing when you're maybe off in the gents or whatever, but they would be bejeweled and there would be these things, but you could hide them away in your pocket. So all of these things men could do. So they could have money, they could have keys, but they could also have all of these other wonderful things hidden away in multiple pockets. So they had trouser pockets, pockets in their vests, pockets in the coat that would go over the vest. So they had layers and layers. And that gets back to that acknowledgement that some men who might have trousers, a shirt, a vest, a jacket, and then an overcoat could have up to 24 pockets on his body that he could use.
24. Wow.
And a woman may have a purse, and that might be it.
Right.
So a lot of difference there. So so we start to see that things increasingly diverge as we go through the 17th century and the 18th century. As we start getting into the 1800s, women start making much more noise about this and complaining that the fashion that they're wearing and that in they're expected to wear as a woman of society is not allowed to function out in the world
Yeah.
the way men's do. So men were getting tons of pockets, and some women would even say, please add pockets into this dress, because they still had to wear dresses, this garment. And the women who were making the clothes would say, absolutely not. It's going to ruin the shape. So for fashion was one reason, it just wasn't done. And so women were really at a disadvantage when they wanted to be able to take things of value with them. Men had all these secret places that fit nicely right close to their body, and they were sewn in. So originally when Taylor started making them, it was an extra charge. So they have these records from the 1600s when they started sewing in and tailoring pockets. And then especially in the 1700s when the three-piece suit came along, then they became sort of standardized. Whereas women, there was no, they were making their own all the way through.
Yeah.
Wasn't even something that you could easily buy, though there were some that you would wear underneath. But then it became purses and this exterior. And so we have a whole other history probably of handbags and purses. But to get back to what's going on, I think when we get to the late 1800s and the early 1900s is where it really gets interesting.
Yeah.
Because women start clamoring for the vote. And along the way, they're complaining about the formality of their dress. They don't want to wear corsets anymore, these long, heavy skirts, and they want pockets. So we're going to get to that in just a second. But one thing I want to point out that I think was very interesting in the 1700s, 1800s was that it wasn't only a measure of gender, whether you had pockets or not. It was a class symbol, because you had to add them on, and people were still hand making all the clothes. So it would have been an extra charge, or you would have had to find extra fabric yourself. And so a lot of middle and lower class people did not have, especially lower class, did not have pockets or even the fake flaps that we sometimes see today. That would have been an additional expense. And so you could tell by looking at someone, if they had pockets, a man, that they were somebody with some wealth. It was a more expensive garment. They had tailoring, and so pockets was privilege. It wasn't, and especially for men, but it definitely signified privilege. One of the ways that some slaves who were trying to escape would get caught is that you could tell that this individual did not have pockets on his clothing. So there's this whole story that Hannah Carlson also tells about the great lengths this one particular escaped slave went to dye a garment so it looked more like expensive wool and add on additions so it looked like he had pockets, so that he would pass as a freed Black man. So it's so many layers and layers of what it can symbolize during this whole period of development. But let's get back to women and suffrage, because I think this is really interesting too, right?
Women start agitating.
Women start agitating, and pockets are part of what they get mad about.
For dress reform, and for also for not having to wear a corset any longer, not having to wear these big heavy dresses, because it's all about mobility. What women wanted to be more mobile, and they wanted to have comfort, so some more levels of comfort, and so they started agitating for dress reform, but also for pockets. So if you want to go to the next slide, Chelsea, or Nancy, I guess Nancy, you gotta do it.
That's me. Okay. So let's, before we get there, we're also gonna, I could maybe just go ahead.
Maybe just go ahead, and we'll come back to these, to the Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Okay. So we're gonna skip ahead, and then we'll come back. There we go.
Okay. So they started agitating for pockets at this time and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, if you haven't heard that name, I'd be surprised, but she was a suffragist, and she wrote this article called The Pocket Problem in 1895. And it was published in many, many newspapers throughout the country. And it starts by saying, oh, pockets, pockets, pockets. Did you ever try to get a dressmaker to put a pocket in your dress and watch her manufacture excuses? You can't have a pocket in this style of skirt, ma'am, but I want one. There isn't any place. Then make one. I can't. There is no place to make it. You wouldn't have a pocket to spoil the seam now, would you? It would bulge you out. It just awful, which I think is so funny. These dressmakers were worried about the bulges. How
it would look. Well, they probably didn't want something coming out of their shop that made Elizabeth Cady Stanton or anyone else look bulgy in the wrong places.
So she goes on to say horrid thought, which gives the the victim pause, then the seance responds. Why can't you put a slanting pocket near the front? I've seen a lot of tailor-made dresses with just such pockets. They are a little on the trousers. They are a little on the trousers order, I suppose, but they are better than nothing. So she goes on about this whole, scenario where the dressmaker will not put in pockets. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton is just furious about the whole pocket situation.
So it's not just pockets, right?
Yeah.
It's they want to vote, they want to have a say
Yep.
in what's going on in the country. They want to have roles in public life. They want to have control outside of the home.
Right.
And it's that way of, again, being able to take what's important to you, what things are personal and private, and be able to move about in the world.
Mhm.
And she recognized if you don't have pockets, you're at a huge disadvantage.
Yeah.
And you're always having to hold on to a purse or something
Yeah.
else. You don't have easily accessible places. You cannot do the things that men do. And it's
Yeah.
part of all of the things that made those gender differences. So the San Francisco Chronicle, this is in 1895, but the San Francisco Chronicle in 1913 is still saying, women are now dragging the pocket into the female emancipation project. So she doesn't just get her way by calling it out.
No.
It takes 20, 30 years before we really start to see women getting there. So I want to go, I feel like I've mixed up my slides a little bit in terms of where we're at in a time period. So I want to go back a little bit and look at the fact that men gaining pockets isn't just something purely functional. There's also a fashionable aspect to it. And one of the things I think we're all super familiar with is that when we go out to a party, you are often at odds about what to do with your hands. And so a lot of us would love to have a pair of pockets that we could put them in, especially if we're not holding a glass of water, some other beverage. So, even if you look at portraiture and what people are doing with their hands, they had to pose the men's hands on something so that they looked like they were doing something important in the Greek sculptures and all these things in these paintings. So if we look at the one all the way on the left, he kind of has his elbow and his hand sort of awkwardly turned on his thigh, and then he's holding something else in his left hand. So it's a little strange. Often the solution was to put the hand into the vest of the three-piece suit, because there was also this concern that if you put your hands in your trouser pockets, that was a no-go, because then your hands were very close to your genitals. And then everyone was like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So they didn't want to put them in a portrait with their hands in those pockets.
Yeah.
But that quickly changed. Within about 50 years or so, we get sort of this whole other, did I skip two? Whoops.
No.
We get men all the way over on the left. You see walking along, say, you know what? I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to put my hands in my pockets and I'm going to look nonchalant and sort of sexy. And I'm just bucking this whole trend. And all of a sudden it became this whole other way of looking very cool. And indeed we see, James Dean, some iconic photos, although the one of his hand in his back pocket, I hadn't seen until I started looking around.
Yeah.
Justin Bieber, when you see them on a red carpet runway, and then famously Walt Whitman made this a very specific choice on the image that would go with leaves of grass. He wanted a hand in his pocket. He wanted to not look overly formal. He wanted to look like this is what it looks like to dress modern and in a democracy. We don't have to have all that formal clothing and worry about where we're putting our hands and worry and have all this anxiety. And he has that, sort of one hip kind of tilted, the hand in the pocket. It makes people look mysterious, a little bit like they're feeling casual, like, yes, I'm at this big, great event, but it's not all of that big of a deal. And so we move on here and we can just see, even if they're selling men's clothes or we're seeing celebrities, hands in the pockets is a fashion statement. And I got to thinking that, well, women have, when they can, also used pockets and wanted pockets in this way. So we move a little bit forward in time after we see this women fighting for the vote, women moving more into public life, but we still have a lot of housewives at home making their own clothes, but now they can at least get patterns that have pockets.
Yeah.
So in some cases, it's a dress you would wear at home, you know, something like you would have almost apron pockets in it. But then you could have these large pockets, it looks like in these strapless night dresses, these gowns going out. And they're saying, that's it, just put on a big gigantic pocket. I mean, they're almost the shape of those ones that you'd
the
wear
earlier
underneath.
ones, right?
They're huge and don't carry a purse. And then you have, I love the black and white one with, as we're moving into women getting a suit. She's got a great jacket and she's got what looks like very teeny pockets in
very
her
small,
skirt. Are
very
they in her
small
skirt?
pockets,
I'm trying to tell, but she's
pockets,
like,
yes.
I love your outfit. Thanks. It has pockets. And we still scream that today. Whether we're buying a dress, they very much want to show you this dress has a pocket. That's a huge advantage of this black dress over the other one you might want to buy, because you can put your hand in there even if you're dressed up. And then I just threw one in of Ellen, who just adopted a lot of the menswear look, because you could have that lovely hands in your pockets and still look, you know, formal and interesting and have all of that sort of mystery about you. So I think the moral of that story is we still really don't have pocket equity, right?
Yeah. So how many of your outfits would you say have pockets? I mean, percentage wise, like how many, you know, and you probably really focus on buying things that have pockets.
We do at my store at Mocha Boutique. We look hard at dresses, and when they have a pocket, we get so excited and we exclaim, and it's our favorite thing to show the person who's about to try on the dress or trying it on. And it's always the phrase, and it has pockets, with all these exclamation points. And people literally, it sometimes just pushes them over to being like, now I need this dress. I don't just want this dress. So I would say it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about it since we've been preparing. And I find that on a very busy day, I purposely pick clothing that has a lot of pockets and that has ease of movement and a lot of pockets. And then I put in, I know if I'm going to be running around doing a lot of things, I know exactly what I need to have on my person, that I can't have a bag on me all the time. I need to have it. So I want to have the right amount of garments with the necessary pockets that can hold a very large phone, you know, as we've been talking about, that might also hold a set of keys, that would hold maybe a small version of a wallet. Now we can have those ones that just take cards. We less and less use cash. Although sometimes that we have that too.
But you have your money in your pocket.
Yes. So my money in my pocket, your ID, your identification in your pocket. You might also need to put a pair of glasses for reading or glasses. And if you don't have a place to put them, you'll lose them, or you'll leave them somewhere, and you know, it ruins anything you're trying to get done that day.
It does.
So it's huge for me. I find that I do have outfits that don't have pockets, and then I have to think hard about what is the bag I'm going to use with that, and is it going to work with that outfit, or is it going to be annoying and or not
be
look
cumbersome?
Right, be cumbersome or be unfashionable. Either one of those things can be really annoying, whereas men don't really ever have to think about that.
They always have a pocket.
What about you? What do you think about your clothing and pockets?
I always have to have something, you know, pants wise, something with back pockets when I'm doing presentations or something like that, because you always want your phone. Because you have to have your phone with you to know what time it is, or to, you know, or have a key with you for your car.
Absolutely.
So it at least need back pockets. And so I think every single clothing item I have that is pants has at least back pockets. But I do have a few pairs of pants that don't have front pockets. And what do you do when you're standing somewhere? That's so uncomfortable.
So awkward when I have a couple pairs of pants that I feel like they're meant for standing. And when I'm working at the shop, it can often be okay because I can use the back pocket for my phone or a few things. But yes, then if I'm standing there, I'm trying to figure out what to do with my hands, and putting them on my hips looks strange. So it is sometimes I put them then in my back pocket, right? It's so strange. And I don't think men ever have to worry about that. I mean, sometimes you need Band-Aids, sometimes you need small things, and those can go nicely in your front pocket. The things I really want to not lose, like if it's a single key for something, front
Front
pocket.
pocket.
Yeah. But it's definitely, what do you think about the bulging in the back pockets? Does that ever bother
I'm
you?
beyond that. When I was younger, I'm like, oh, I can put my keys in my back pocket because I'll have this big bulge. But now I'm just like, oh, I don't care.
Yeah. I don't have to look at
Yeah.
it, so kind
Yeah.
of
And I
I
need
kind
my
of get over it.
keys, so
But
I'll
I
put them
don't
in
want that
there.
if I'm
Yeah.
going to a formal event.
No, that's different. I mean, and so that's why this movement towards dresses with pockets has been so huge because then you can wear a dress to a formal occasion that has pockets and you can have your keys and your phone, and your credit card.
Right.
And so you're good to go then.
Right.
You're solid,
And I
Yeah.
think there are some styles of women's dresses, it works beautifully. If
Yeah.
you're wearing a very form-fitting,
Yeah. I mean,
slinky
it
fabric,
doesn't
okay,
work.
but
Yeah.
most of the time, but then sometimes you can have a wonderful little jacket that'll
Yeah.
work. Or, people, wear the crossbody purses now sort of
Mhm.
as part of their outfit.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something that I think I have to think about every day because
Mhm.
there is so much stuff. We all leave the house now. So
Yeah.
many women,
Yeah.
so many women have a place where they have to go to work, or they at least
Yeah.
have to go manage their children and whatever they have to do with groceries,
Outside
doctors
the home.
outside the home that they
Yeah.
have to go to. So yes, and I remember my mom always complaining. She had
Oh,
a
yeah.
million purses on
The
your
weight of
arm,
the purse.
and then they
Yeah.
either had too many pockets in the purse
Yeah.
or not enough. And I've lost things in my purse.
Oh,
Have you?
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Whereas you don't lose them in your pocket.
No, because our pockets these days are not as large as the
No.
ladies in the 1600s or
Right.
1700s.
Right. But then,
Yeah.
then it's like your car and you find
Yeah.
crusty things in
Yeah.
there, like that bread you were talking that they
Yeah.
might, yeah, that's not good either.
No.
But I've noticed even so athletic wear, right? How many
Mhm.
people have yoga pants now
That
that
have
have that phone
pockets.
pocket, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
they have
exactly, which
shorts
is
that
so
have
nice.
even running shorts have little places for a key or a little bit of money or your
Yeah.
ID. It'll just be something small but necessary so that you can still be out in the world and have all those items that you absolutely need.
Yeah.
So I think we are seeing so much happening now, but to me, it was interesting to see what a fight it had to be. Now I
Yeah.
think we have the choice and we have choices
Mhm.
about what we
Mhm.
can wear for any event.
Yeah.
And you might have to search them out a little farther. And it is sometimes a matter of cost and quality of
Mhm.
a garment
Mhm.
still,
Mhm.
to determine if you're going to have real pockets or fake pockets. They had
Yeah.
another story about a young girl who wrote the CEO of Old
Oh,
Navy
yeah. Yeah.
because they had fake pockets on the front of the girls' jeans.
Yeah.
And she
And
was
she did
upset
not like that.
because, yeah, she wanted real pockets and all the boys' jeans had real pockets in the front. And so, what
Yeah.
was that about? 7-year-old girl, poor
Yeah.
thing. I know. So good for her.
Good for
She's an
her.
early young
Yeah.
feminist
Early
fighting for
on.
her pockets.
Right.
I know.
But I think this pocket, this dive into the pockets has really made me think more about women's lives, especially women's lives in the 16 and 1700s. That's, not our time period.
Absolutely. Right.
And so to me, it really showed that women did have pockets were a form of agency. It was how they had some agency in their lives because a lot of women, especially women who were working class women or lower class women, did not have, they had so little agency. They had so little privacy. They had so little freedoms. But the pocket was something that they could have some privacy within and have some agency. That's where their agency was located because that's often where their valuables were held. And so to me, that was so fascinating. And you can learn so much from looking at these pockets. And I encourage you to read these books because they go in this book and then the book that Nancy read because they go into such detail about these women's lives. And I learned so much.
That I think was the most interesting
Yeah.
thing. And that who would have thought that the primary records at a court
Yeah.
in London in 1700s, 1800s would have revealed so much
Mhm.
about women's lives, women who we don't normally get a record of what their lives are like. And so much of that is the materials, what they could have on their person or what they couldn't have on their person,
Right.
and then
Yeah.
as much as, so I think the fashion, clothing, all of the way in which we cover ourselves, all of that says so much. And then, as they mentioned, outside of Europe, as pockets really caught on, in Europe, especially in men's garments, they very quickly became adopted in other cultures and other places because they were so incredibly functional. I mean, now they can be fashionable and functional and all of those, and everybody wants them. I think kids want pockets too.
I think they do. So I just want to read a quote from the book to kind of maybe finish us up. But she says, they say that pockets could be an instrument of female empowerment, granting them mobility, autonomy, and agency. And I think that's kind of what we learned. And so I encourage everyone, if you want a pocket, buy something with a pocket in it, because we now have the ability to do that.
And men can buy purses now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a thing, right?
Yeah,
Especially those crossbodies. My son wears one. So I guess his pockets aren't enough. I don't know. Or it's just a fashion statement. But they seem to have it all ways.
Yes.
As men often do. But yeah, so I think that'll end us up, right? And I'll go ahead and just thank all our listeners out there for joining us today. And if you love this podcast, please do tell a friend and make sure that you subscribe on your podcast feed so that it shows up each week. And please leave us a review so people can find us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And thanks for listening today. We hope you can join us again to find out more about the dirt on the past.
And a big thank you to the Rockies for the use of this beautiful studio space. Thanks to the Museum of the Rockies, Chelsea Hogan. Thanks, Chelsea. Yay! Come in. Peek in real quick.
Where are you?
There you are.
There's a nice close-up. That's awesome.
Also, Ashley Hall, Melissa Dawn, Michael Fox, and thanks to Lawson Alegria for mixing the music. And also for this one especially, you might want to check out our YouTube page, the Extreme History Project YouTube page. The video version as well as the audio will be there. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.